Well, good day, everyone, from here in London. I'm absolutely delighted to have a webinar today. It's freezing cold over in Poland, I've been assured, but here it is moderately warm in London today. And our two guests, Marek and Dora, will be coming on in just a moment. Now, today's topic is going paperless, and it's all about very much e-signatures or digital signatures over in Central and Eastern Europe. This may sound like an arcane subject, but actually we got a couple of emails already with questions for our panel, which is a sign of a seriously eager if specialist audience. Now, you might know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is my delight to be able to introduce another one in our webinar series. And this is only possible because of the great support we get from our sponsors who let us range widely and freely across all sorts of subjects to do with finance, technology, and economics. And today we're going to definitely be looking at a combination of finance, technology, economics, and the law. So our session today is basically I'm trying to get out of your way so you can hear from our experts, Dora and Marek. And we have got a presentation of about 25 minutes from them on some of the interesting bits that are going on in Central and Eastern Europe with e-signatures, and we have sufficient time for questions. A reminder, please do type your questions into the GoToWebinar question facility because I'm here with you and not on email, and so I'll only get your questions in later, and I will feed questions, comments, observations, or experiences into the conversation that we will be having with our two guests later on. But as I say, my job is to get out of the way, and we have both Dora and Marek. You've seen their biographies and background on the invitation, so I won't read them out, but coming in from CMS in Poland, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. It is my great pleasure to be in here today. And without further ado, I will just dive in as that was the instruction that we got. Today we will talk about e-signatures in CEE, but before we do that, I would also like to lay the scene a little bit about talking about digital horizons, about the digital transformation state currently in CEE. And then we will go to the Q&A as well. Can I please have the next slide? So without further ado, we're right in the middle. When it came about the idea to do a survey about digital horizons, what we did is that we wanted to think about topics that keep quite a few people awake at night. And one of the questions that is actually also in our report is exactly that. So do you think that the pandemic will accelerate digital transformation in organizations? Please push 1 if yes is your answer, 2 if no, and 3 to a limited extent. I'm very much interested in your views, and then we will compare it with our findings in the report.
So folks, if you just look in your questionnaire facility and just answer the question, yes, no, or to a limited extent. Just a little bit more time for voting. We're up to 2/3 of the audience have voted. And I will close the voting now and share the results with everybody. So very much 3/4 of the audience believe that the pandemic will accelerate digital transformation.
That's fantastic. In a second, you will see the results of the study. But before we do that, and I have a little explanation on how the study came about on the next slide. So what we wanted to do is that we have surveyed 18 countries in CEE. We have made personal interviews with many of the regional general counsels, and not only lawyers, but also CXOs from like CTOs of some banks like Erste Bank, Unicredit, Magyar Telekom, which is a Deutsche Telekom subsidiary, Coca-Cola, Siemens, and others. So we wanted to be as sector agnostic as possible. And then we also issued a questionnaire, a survey with over 100 respondents. And we have asked different questions about digitalization, about strategies, about investment plans, about regulation and risk. The outcome is a report with what I would call an executive summary, and 4 chapters, one about infrastructure, the other one about data and ethics, the third one about regulation versus innovation or for innovation, and the fourth one about infrastructure and digital transformation. So here is on the next slide, you have a couple of our headline data. And the first says that compared to your 77%, 92% of the participants believe that the pandemic will accelerate future digital change in their business. So I think part of the why could there be any difference, although it's not a big difference. I think the difference might be that we're now in, I think, the 10th month of the pandemic, so everybody has made the first steps over digital transformation. Probably if we asked it back in the summer what we did with our audience, the answer would have been even more overwhelming. A couple of the other findings that we will be referring to later when we talk about Esignatures is that only half, a little bit more than half, see that the public sector is making some progress in digitalization. I think it's absolutely key to the public sector to lead by example in this respect, because the many applications and the many use cases that they can provide can generate the audience and the interest for the use of e-signatures and other digital transformation as well. 58% already use AI solutions, and another 35% are actually considering to launch some AI solutions in the next year or so, which is very close to 100%. But at the same time, 86% of our respondents said that they are worried about AI legal liability issues. That's a big contradiction in my view, and that is the tension that the EU white paper is, which is about the regulation of AI and is taking a very risk-based approach, is trying to somehow level out. One of the questions where I wasn't expecting that much answer is actually whether your IT budget is increasing. It's a very confidential question in my view, but fortunately our respondents were very open, and 65% confirmed that they're planning to increase their IT budget despite all the cost cuts that they are incurring. And the last part is one of my favorites. The last highlight, 98% of the respondents, so you can see that almost everybody consider ethics as part of their current guidelines and policies. To me, that's very reassuring, and also a huge challenge for lawyers, because it's no longer about what is written in regulations. You think about ethical aspects as well. So with this, I am concluding talking about the Horizons report, and over to Marek, who will just share with us one more detail.
Yes, thank you very much, Dora. This is Marek Oleks from CMS Warsaw. And indeed, one of the points which we tried to touch upon with our contacts while performing the survey was to check if and to what extent the local bureaucracy in each of the CE jurisdictions constitute a kind of impediment to companies' digital agenda. And again, the answers to that questions were very interesting, because when you have a look on the reply concerning that public authorities have made some advances, but the level of bureaucracy is high, and if you combine it with the second answer, then you have like 2/3 of all the respondents saying that unfortunately bureaucracy throughout CE jurisdictions is still high as regards comparison with digital agenda and digital developments of organizations. There are, of course, some answers showing that the bureaucracy is already low, or perhaps that the government has made some progress and public authorities as regards complying with the digital progress. But still, as you may see on this chart, it was the response from our surveyed contacts and clients that 2/3 of the respondents confirmed that unfortunately bureaucracy is still high in terms of compliance with digitalization challenges. Thank you. So if we could please move to the next slide. Yeah, and what's very interesting is that based on this broad and range variety businesses-oriented survey, we have come up to certain conclusions concerning how is digitalization doing in the CEE, especially given the pandemic situation. And these could be summarized in the remarks or comments, conclusions which you may see on this chart, which show first that indeed still bureaucracy to some extent slows down the transition. Then it turned out, based on the responses which we have received from our clients, that regulatory compliance and the ethical use of data put the burden on the businesses with which those businesses need to cope with. What Dora has already mentioned is that perhaps if we can anyhow mention that, is that the pandemic has indeed significantly accelerated the shift to digital. Perhaps in some cases it was not only the acceleration, but actually it triggered shifting and jumping into digital world. And perhaps last, but very interesting for lawyers, and it also comes up from different CEE legal regimes, is that indeed with respect to digitalization and jumping into digital work, having the right local advice may be crucial, because not all the aspects of digitalization can be determined on the EU pan-European level, and the local nuances pertaining to digitalization may play a key role in this field, depending, of course, also on the sector in which a given business or organizations operate. Yes, I think we can move to the next slide.
And thank you. So let's dive into the e-signatures in CEE. Right into the pandemic, we have experienced an increased number of questions on how can I sign a document. I can't do physical signatures, vetting signatures anymore. Is it valid or is it not valid? Is it enforceable or not enforceable? And the questions were so broad that we did another survey. And that time, actually, we didn't survey our audience and our clients. We have prepared a study rather than a survey, but it was also based on a robust questionnaire to our internal audience. And we have asked our lawyers in, I think, 15 or 17 jurisdictions first, but then it turned actually now to a global brochure on e-signatures. Part of that is our e-signatures guide, and you already have the link to that guide in the chat box. So if we move ahead to the next slide, please. I would like to ask one more question about e-signatures before we talk about the findings. So please choose the correct answer. Across CEE, e-signatures can now effectively replace traditional vetting signatures, subject to a few exceptions, and these are generally prohibited, or can be used, but the legalities vary from country to country.
So that's great. So we've got the poll up there. 2/3 have voted. I'm just going to hold it up for just another few seconds, Dora.
Absolutely.
Past 3/4 of the audience. That's great. I'm going to shut it now and share the results.
Oh, you are so right. And unfortunately, I wish I could have confirmed that they can now effectively replace traditional vetting signatures, end of the sentence, end of the presentation, and everybody can go home. But unfortunately not. The landscape, despite a European regulation in place, is anything but harmonized throughout Europe. And as you will see in our our slides, it's actually strikingly different in not only in Central Eastern Europe, but throughout Europe and across the globe as well. So as I said, we prepared a survey, and now I will hand over to Marek, who will tell us a couple of things before we dive into questions and answers. Over to you, Marek.
Thank you very much, Dora. Yes, so as mentioned by Dora, we have conducted an in-depth survey concerning where we stand in the CE countries as regards electronic signatures, and to what extent, and more specifically, in which areas of law can e-signatures be used in an uninterrupted way or cannot be restricted. And the results of the survey were very interesting, and they provided lots of materials to think about as regards effectiveness and the use of electronic signatures throughout different CE countries. And what we would like to share with you today are the key takeaways and comments based on the survey, which will be presented in the next slides. There was the key conclusion arising from our survey was that in order to make any kind of statements and final conclusions as to what types of e-signatures are allowed, then in each jurisdictions we must first determine what constitutes a written statement where local legislation or local jurisdiction requires to observe in order to have some statements of will, some declarations of will being effectively made, regardless of whether they pertain to contracts or to unilateral statements, to powers of attorney, for example. In case given local CE jurisdiction requires such a written statement, then determination of what is understood as a written statement will trigger subsequent conclusions as to what types of e-signatures are indeed accepted by each national law, in terms, of course, of observing those types of transactions or statements where a written form is required. But what is more interesting, or at least equally interesting, is that almost in each jurisdiction, there are some cases, instances, some types of transactions where, regardless of how much qualified e-signature we will use, then it will simply not suffice in order to be effective, given that a wet ink statement or a wet ink signature is required by the signatory for a transaction or for a deal to be performed effectively. And so we could move to the next slide, where we would like to share with you the key legal areas which are very important from our CMS practice when we assist our clients on their daily business, where e-signatures apply or may apply, or where we have lots of comments from our local jurisdictions. So they pertain to employment regulations with very interesting conclusions and takeaways, to commercial contracts, to real estate transactions, to corporate business, meaning here mostly the lifetime of a company, its structuring, its operations, but also its outside relations with other market players, as well as in banking and finance. So the results of the survey were different based on each CE jurisdiction, but also they differed and varied with respect to each type of legal area, which we summarized on this slide. And what we thought may be let's say the most illustrative would be to show the example based on the commercial contracts, but this will be shown in a second. In the next slide, we would like just to draw your attention to a few important points concerning application and use of e-signatures in the CEE. Namely, without perhaps discussing those types of e-signatures in detail at this stage, we thought it's important to mention that in those cases where a local law requires a written form, it's crucial to check what kind of electronic signature a party is planning to apply or should be obliged to apply in order for a transaction to be valid and to be effective, or a statement of will to be made effectively. So those notions pertaining to different types of electronic signatures, they are quite uniform and unified throughout Europe. You can find respective definitions in the last point set out in this email, the EEBAS Regulation 910 dated 2014, which deals pan-European on a pan-European level on application of e-signatures with an exhaustive list of definitions. But what should be kept in mind from this perspective is that depending on the standard of security applied to a given digital or electronic signature, you can distinguish between a simple or standard electronic signature, like, for example, sending an email or typing your last name or your surname and name on a Word document or in the email. Whereas a one grade higher, there is an advanced electronic signature where you can confirm person making such a statement, but this is based on a certificate which is not an independent one. And only the third one, the qualified electronic signature, is the one that, according to the European legislator, should, in every jurisdiction, equal with the handwritten form of a legal statement. So perhaps not discussing those differences at this stage in detail, it should be kept in mind that whenever there is an opportunity or a need to jump into electronic signature, it's crucial to check what kind of electronic signature we are using, because the regulation and the local national legislations, like for Poland, for example, they confirm that handwritten form may be equal only with the qualified electronic signature. Yes, so we can right now shift into the next slide. And yes, and as mentioned, we focused on commercial contracts for the purposes of our today meeting, but the general conclusions are the same for all types of areas of law, for the employment, banking, finance, corporate, commercial, or real estate, which means that although businesses and market players can use e-signatures to sign different types of contracts in different jurisdictions, it very much varies from country to country in the CE region as to what type of electronic signature has legal effect, whether the documents signed with different types of e-signatures qualify as the written statement, and the situations where local laws indeed require a wet ink signature, where even a qualified electronic signature is just insufficient. And the next two charts show a good example based on examination of different commercial contracts throughout CE. This is an abbreviated version in the report which we have prepared. So Dora will mention this later on, and you will see much more information and much more details pertaining to results of our survey. But this is just an example to grasp where we have compared different types of signatures which are being applied by the clients, by business, and we checked them, we confronted them with the legal requirement for some types of agreements where a written form is required. And as you may see on this chart, actually in every jurisdiction where there is a qualified electronic signature, even without timestamp, then you have the written form observed. But when you jump into further types of electronic signatures, like advanced electronic signature with timestamp or a simple electronic signature, then we'll have some other types of making an agreement or making the declaration or a statement by a party, then, as you may see, it very much depends on the jurisdiction. And, for example, you may see that you can easily trace the countries in the CE region, which are, let's say, we can call them much more liberal as regards acceptance of certain electronic forms being equal with the handwritten form. For example, you may see the Czech Republic as a good example, but also on the next chart you'll see that on this chart and the next one that Slovakia is also accepting and very forward-looking as regards transactions being made electronically. And here on the second slide, you can see some of the examples which we deal with as lawyers assisting our clients, where different agreements are being executed or are being signed or are planned to be signed, not by making a wet ink signature, but for example, when there is a scanned electronic version of a document, which is hand signed, but then it is just exchanged by email, for example, as a PDF document. For example, we examined and checked how effectiveness of such an agreement work in case it is sent as a text in ordinary email without electronic signature, but with a standard email signature panel. Or, for example, the last one where the agreement is accepted through an online platform provided by the other party. So, based on this comparison, tested on commercial contracts, you may see that lots depends on the local jurisdictions, but it depends not only on the local laws, but also on the case law and practice in a given country. Because I can for sure tell it for Poland that even though we have some legislation put in place which corresponds with the EEBAS regulation, then still there is room for questions, for doubts, and for discussions, and for case law as well as regards effectiveness of a given contract. So lots more of information will be shared with you in our Esignatures guide throughout this meeting. But based on this commercial example, you can see how different it can work. Yes. And perhaps maybe just one final remark is that as regards those types of agreements where even though qualified electronic signature equals with a wet ink signature, you can see it very clearly in the real estate part of our report that there are some types of transactions where, given that specific form should be observed, like, for example, form of a notarial deed or a form where signatures of the party are confirmed by notary public, then in such cases, the conclusion shows that this cannot be substituted by qualified electronic signature, and the handwritten wet ink signature is necessary still. Right. So that's what we'd like to share, and we are ready and happy to address any questions.
Well, Dora and Marek, thank you very much. There actually are quite a few questions. It sounds like an arcane area, but you've sparked a lot of interest. One question is from Neil. Neil works for a bank that has operations in Slovakia, and he asks, he's got one key question for you. We are facing some challenges specifically in Slovakia, where we cannot seem to accept e-signatures for documents that define themselves as delegation documents. For example, a power of attorney. There is a local law that states such individuals that sign with capacity for delegation on documents need their ID verified, and therefore documents cannot be e-signed. And he would like some more guidance on that point, if you could provide it. I will also, by the way, Neil, put you directly in touch with Dora and Marek after this session, because there are a few points of detail. But Dora, perhaps over to you for some thoughts on that.
Thank you. Actually, I'm now looking at this our reports, banking and finance contracts section, and it is quite liberal in Slovakia. I see that they have ticked many of the boxes, and it seems to me that that the answer would be yes. for your question, even if, for example, you would send a simple SMS or sign a copy-pasted image of a handwritten signature. So what I suggest is that why don't the two of us take it offline, and then we can look at the specifics, and then hopefully we'll provide you with a good answer that you need.
Good. There's an interesting point here. Edwina Morton writes that it seems like a very high percentage of respondents say they already cover ethical issues. Did you explore this further just to make sure they weren't just, ethics washing and giving you the answers they thought you should be given, whatever their own practices?
It's an excellent question. Actually, what we did, we not only did the survey, but we did also interviews with about 20 of our respondents. And they confirmed that they are seriously considering ethical issues as well. Of course, this is still not a huge amount of data, and I don't need to tell everybody how important the data set is. We want it to be as thorough as possible. But we do believe, and also I can speak of personal experience, that I receive more and more questions around data. We also had another question which highlighted this issue from a slightly different angle. It's like a control question, and that was the question was whether you have changed your approach to use of sensitive data since the start of the pandemic. And 64% of the respondents said yes. And to me, that confirms that they are really thinking about the merits of the use of data, about the merits of what they are doing with that data. I must say also that as a practicing lawyer in the region, we had a huge outburst of questions around employment questions. So what is it that you can force your employees to do? What is it that you can ask your employees to do? And what is it where the different level of your engagements and the fact that they are in somewhat an exposed position to you basically doesn't mean that their approval is in any way a go signal for you. So there are many ethical questions already in place, and with more and more use of technology and more use of data, you will see an uptake on that.
Okay, good. I noticed, of course, that Dora, you're in Hungary, and Marek, you're in Poland. I mean, do you experience problems between your offices in Esignature?
Marek, over to you.
That's a very good question, Michael, but I think it indeed also touches upon a very crucial topic, which is somehow to some extent maybe overseen, and it's perhaps important to draw attention to this point as well. Namely, we are dealing more and more with cross-border transactions on every type of contracts, actually. Just to give you an example, I'm practicing mostly on the intellectual property, which where we are dealing very frequently with global cross-border license agreements or technology assignment agreements, where the parties indeed consider to have some contracts concluded electronically instead of meeting in person or exchanging hard copies of documents. And from this perspective, it's also good to know that, and your question shows this point, that since lots of agreements are being signed by business entities located in different countries, then it's indeed important to check which law should determine what form is necessary to have the agreement effective. For example, a copyright license under Polish law requires a written form under the sanction of nullity only in case such a license is exclusive in its character. But in case it's being made with a Hungarian licensor, for example, or a German or the UK one or a US one, then indeed it's crucial to check which law we should determine to check to show us the form of our legal statements. And here, of course, the Rome regulation is very helpful, which is fortunately for the businesses, let's say, very elastic as regards forum and the law based on which we determine the form of a signature. but we also have national, private, international laws which show that, for example, the form of a licensing contract or any kind of contract is the one which corresponds with the law chosen by the parties. So in other words, we should also be quite mindful when we decide to execute an agreement electronically in light of a law governing the form of the parties' signatures.
Okay, good. Bob McDowell is a lawyer who's based in the Channel Islands, and he's got a couple of interesting questions that he sent through. He wonders that, property rights, their transfer and assignment pose particular challenges to the deployment of e-signatures, in part because of the deep historical property law legislation. Did you find this in your survey, that the depth of property law was an impediment to e-signatures?
Yes.
Marek,
yes.
you want to take it? Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Dora. Yes, indeed, because it's actually one of the areas. Thank you very much for this question, which indeed shows that property transfers is the area of law where e-signatures are still, let's say, not as commonly applied as in other areas of law, given the specific form which is required by the parties to effectively transfer ownership rights, for example, to real property, where more than just a wedding signature is required. For example, in Poland, we need a notarial deed for a transfer of real property, which means that it cannot be substituted effectively with qualified electronic signature. And this rule may also apply to cross-border assignment or transfer of ownership transactions where real property is at stake. And indeed, that's a very good question, because here we are, let's say, not yet, at least for Poland, for example, not yet sufficiently prepared to have electronic version substitute the form of a notarial deed. Another good example, for example, is a transfer of shares in a limited liability company, where a simple written form is not sufficient. So we need signatures of the parties certified by notary public, which again cannot be substituted simply by a qualified electronic signature. So indeed, there are some areas of law which need some restrictions as regards going digital.
Okay. Bob had a further question. How can it be ensured that e-signatures are buried or destroyed on death and other life-changing events? Any thoughts on that?
That depends on the signatures, I think. If it's a simple electronic signature, there's no need to do that, and I don't think this is done and dealt with properly under the current regulations. Whereas if you talk about an advanced or qualified e-signature, there are certain rules set out in the regulation which need to be followed.
As we were warming up, you reminded me of a story where Ed Lucas, who writes for The Economist, had been going across Europe looking at e-signatures a couple of years ago, and he was looking particularly with his Estonian card, and he said that as he went further south, it got a little bit harder and harder. So the Scandinavian countries, no trouble. Germany, pretty good. France, not so good. Italy, Spain, Greece, forget it. And then he came back to Britain, and somebody asked him, what about e-signatures in Britain? And he said, oh, I rang my bank and I asked them, and they said, oh, e-signatures, no problem. Just sign the form and fax it over to us. So yeah, that was a bit scary. But Britain, as you know, London is a center for finance, and many people here around our group are doing transactions via London from all sorts of places around the world in FS Club. Do you see any issues post-Brexit with e-signatures, or is Britain moving in the right direction, or static, or what do you think about, for example, our conforming with EIDAS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but no, I perhaps may start, as that's indeed a very good question, and it not only pertains to being in parallel post Brexit, but also other areas of law let's say, meet with lawyers and businesses, question tax as regards how it will work in practices specifically. But as regards being compliant and meeting the same standards in terms of electronic signatures, we would assume here that no big issues should arise in this respect, given that the major legislation was put in place already a couple of years ago. I mean, the regulation EEBAS. So I think the standards should be kept the same. Rather, we would expect that we would be to some extent may follow up and chase the British solutions as regards e-signatures. But as regards effectiveness and reciprocity in recognizing electronic signatures, this should remain unchanged, I would say.
Okay. We've sadly come to the end of time, which I always know because people are sending in thanks. So that's a good sign, but nevertheless a sign that we need to bring it in. Any final comments from either of you, Dora or Marek?
Marek, you start, and then I'm very happy to wrap up.
Yes, maybe perhaps just one comment that we will be very helpful to check whether you may have any comments or thoughts once also you have a chance to have a look on our e-signatures CE survey. There is lots of information, so we'll be just curious to hear whether you may have any additional follow-up questions.
Dora?
Yeah, and thank you. I would like to draw the attention to the EEBAS regulation, which Marek mentioned. It is now under review because I think it's fair to say that it failed the original purpose because there is no harmonization yet in Europe, and the current review is set to come to close by end of this year. I hope it is still feasible. But I just wanted to say, watch this space and look for the amendments which are to be published hopefully already in December, because everybody is now expecting more harmonization, more uniform approach, at least in different branches of in relation to e-signatures.
Very good.
But thank you very much.
I'll come back to you in a minute if I may. Just by way of wrapping up, I've got 3 rounds of thanks to give. The first, as ever, is to our sponsors. We have a wide variety of sponsors, but many of them involved in areas ranging from Estates and Infrastructure Exchange, which is looking at e-signatures for the automated property area. Many of the firms here are experts in this field, and I think that they really appreciate your survey. Secondly, if I could, I'd like to thank the audience. You've been really good today. I was afraid that we wouldn't have questions, believe it or not. I thought this would be an arcane area, but you were clearly very interested, and I will be sending those on to Marek and Dora. We do have some interesting stuff ahead for you. Tomorrow we have What Does Banking Stand For, which is Chris Skinner, who set up FS Club, is going to be talking about his thoughts about the ethics of banking looking ahead. We have a fascinating thing with Archbishop John McDowell up in Northern Ireland, second in our series on what can religions of the book teach finance. He'll be looking at money in the New and Old Testament. We have a really interesting one, more on law again, innovation in the law in IT, where we're going to have dialing in from The Hague, HIIL, which you'll learn more about. And next week we'll be looking at investing in technology. So all ahead and as ever on the website. But may I in particular take this opportunity to thank you, Dora and Marek, for leading us through this and also for sharing your report, folks. I look forward to just getting the report either here out of the chat room or it is also posted on the same webpage that you registered. Unfortunately, I can't open the floodgates of applause, so I bring my little own applause-o-meter here. This is my Korean karmic clapper or a bong from my Buddhist temple in Bulgoksa. So I will thank you on behalf of everyone and really appreciate it. And thanks so much for sharing a survey that I think a lot of us are going to find more and more important as we see the way in which Britain in particular is changing, but also the evolution of the EU in pushing this type of standardization. So I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.